Something I've never understood is why Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are so disliked.
Huh?
Well, I mean, that's not true. I do get it, I just personally thought the game was pretty good. Maybe it's because the nostalgia of the Sinnoh region really just carries the game for me, and my cloudy lenses don't evaluate the game as hard as I would a different game. Like, I still remember to this day getting Pokemon Platinum right before I went on a spring break trip to Florida, and the struggle to find each of the clowns in Jubilife City so I could finally get the Poketch. I think the main criticism of BDSP is that there just is not that much change or addition to the Sinnoh region compared to the changes made in other remakes. And that's something I want to look at today. Although remakes are first and foremost evaluated by players on nostalgia, a large emphasis is also placed on what has changed. And I do want to make clear, I won't really be talking about the Let's Go games or the Legends series. I do want to make a future video about the unique situation Legends ZA finds itself in, but that's for a different time. Let's get into it. Of course, the main thing I'm going to touch on is the changes required to put a remake on that next level of excellence, but first I want to explain my main point, which is really there needs to be like a baseline of nostalgia met before you can get into that next tier, where quality is then graded on additions and changes. Now, all of the main remakes that I'm going to be talking about in this video essentially have the same story and main game as their original counterparts, but what game I think proves my point here is Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. While this game is mostly the same as Red and Blue, I think there are enough changes here to remove that base level of nostalgia that would have carried most reviews of the game. Obviously, there's the change in wild Pokemon, which definitely detracts from the core Pokemon experience and honestly might be one of the reasons why we haven't seen another Let's Go game yet. To some people, one of the most endearing parts about playing through a Pokemon game is the team building aspect, and that includes running back and forth in the tall grass until you get your 10% encounter. But in Let's Go, there are no random tall grass encounters, and the player just needs to run around until a Pokemon spawns in the overworld. While this may seem like a quality of life upgrade, I'm willing to bet that it is a downgrade, at least to some players. But what might seem small but could be even a larger drop in the nostalgia factor is the absence of Blue as the player's main rival throughout the game. I'm not a Gen 1er myself, but I imagine the absence of the iconic line, "Smell you later," detracts quite a bit of nostalgia from their experience. After all, Blue is one of the most iconic characters in the entire franchise, and him not being the rival in a remake of a game that he's the rival in probably confuses some people. The last thing that, at least as a story person, would probably matter to me is the few changes that Let's Go makes to the story of Gen 1. Now, while you could argue that the introduction of Archer and the other small changes makes the story of Let's Go better than the one in Red and Blue, I think it's also a factor in how much nostalgia potentially was lost. Of course, there's probably other things that were changed in Let's Go that probably matter to the people who cherish Gen 1 so dearly, but I hope I've highlighted enough changes to where you can see how Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee are such a departure from the original games that I think a lot of nostalgia for those titles is not brought over. So then, how are other remakes different? If my whole point in this video is to explain why the quality of a remake is dependent on what has changed from the original game, then why did I just spend a decent amount of time explaining how Let's Go doesn't apply to this rule because they made too many changes? I think it's because it's important to look at what changes and what doesn't change between the remakes and originals, and how what changes contributes to the nostalgia of a player. When we look at the 4 core remakes, we see that in each and every one of those 4 games, the core main playthrough experience has not changed, really at all. Looking at the other Kanto remake, Fire Red and Leaf Green, the main game has not changed. Team Rocket, Blue, no gym requirements, and all the other new stuff introduced in the Let's Go games do not exist in Fire Red and Leaf Green. What I refer to as the core playthrough experience is the same in Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Red and Blue. and the same can be said about the other 3. The core story of both Heart Gold Soul Silver and BDSP are the exact same as their counterparts to my understanding. And Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire switches things up a little with an extra encounter with Team Magma and Aqua on Southern Island, plus the switch to Primal Groudon or Kyogre, but really, the core story of Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire is the same as their originals, even if there are a few specific changes. So because the core playthrough experience hasn't changed, I feel as though all these games hit that baseline level of sameness that is required to trigger that warm and fuzzy nostalgic feeling that players associate with these games. And I think with that level of nostalgia, that's enough to be let in the door for discussions about being a successful Pokemon remake. But once you enter that door, I feel as though the discussion of what makes a remake good shifts from what's the same to what's different. And I think that to become the best remake possible, you have to fill 3 aspects of differentiation or addition: third game features, post-game content, and experimentation or gimmicks. I'll go through each of these subtopics and explain what I mean, and how I feel each of the core remakes does in that aspect. We'll also grade them on a pass-fail metric and see how the grades in these aspects correlate pretty well with how each game was critically received. So the first aspect I'm looking at is third game features. For the first 4 generations, Game Freak released 2 opposing versions for the first installment in that generation and region, and would later release a third game for that same region that would largely keep the entire journey the same, but would make a few changes. In every single core remake Pokemon has released thus far, they have released 2 different versions of the same game, which have the same story as the original 2 games from that generation. But in the very best remakes, there is some sort of implementation of some of the changes made in those third versions. Let's start by taking a look at Fire Red and Leaf Green. Now, these games are inherently at a disadvantage from other generations just because of how similar Red and Blue are to Yellow. Really, the only changes that I can think of are the use of Pikachu and Jesse and James from Team Rocket. Neither of these are in Fire Red or Leaf Green, but I'm not really sure if I can even take off any points for that. Obviously, you're not going to change the starters, but maybe it could have been interesting to see Jesse and James in some sort of capacity in the post game. I feel like Red, Blue, and Yellow are just so similar that any criticism I have is just nitpicking. So no, there's no features from Yellow in the remakes, but really, I don't think that's an issue. Next up is Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, and as you'll soon come to see throughout this video, I do think that these 2 games are the golden standard for remakes. And in respect to the incorporation of the third game, that's no different. In Pokemon Crystal, the player follows the story of a mystery man named Eugene who is obsessed with Suicune. While it can be debated how large of an impact he has on the story of Pokemon Crystal, I do think that him and Suicune are the biggest change from Gold and Silver to Crystal. And in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Eugene is reimagined to still be a presence in the remakes, but he takes more of a back seat as the core story of Ho-Oh and Lugia takes center stage. And I think this formula is the best way to incorporate third game features into that generation's remake. Obviously, the focus of the remake is still going to be on their cover art legendaries, but bringing in a central aspect, in this case a character, from the third game into that remake, and slotting them into a more supporting and less central role is really a great idea. Because if we bring back the nostalgia factor, there could be a group of people who are only nostalgic for Crystal and not Gold and Silver. And by bringing Eugene into the remakes, I feel like that checks that nostalgia box for those players. Plus, I personally view the remakes as remaking the entire region instead of just the first 2 titles, so this incorporation helps in that aspect as well. Definitely a passing grade here. Up next, we're looking at the Hoenn games, and I think this is the generation that really started to make impactful changes in their third game, because I feel like in Emerald there are quite a few things that are different throughout, from dealing with both Team Magma and Aqua, to the dramatic intervention of Rayquaza at the climax of the story. And going back to the fact that Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are remakes of Ruby and Sapphire, you can't really use a lot of the more dramatic changes that Emerald brought to the Hoenn region in the main game. So Game Freak decided to include the Delta episode. And while the Delta episode doesn't bring the player back to the Team Magma hideout from Emerald or recreate the climax of the game, it does create a very convincing story that adds lore and context to the Hoenn of Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire and allows the player to capture the most powerful Pokemon at the time, Mega Rayquaza. From purely a remake standpoint, I think it effectively brings some of that punch and nostalgia that Emerald had without overwriting what these games were supposed to be, which is Ruby and Sapphire remakes. So the final remake to look at in this aspect is, of course, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. And you'd think that the developers for this game would be looking to do something similar to either Heart Gold Soul Silver or Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire. But for BDSP, there's nothing that really is added from Platinum. I mean, yes, there's some smaller integration of some features from Platinum, but where's the distortion world? I personally would think that a Delta episode type of thing would have really worked here, which could have sent the player back to the distortion world to learn more about the Creation Trio and the Sinnoh region as a whole. With one of the most memorable settings in the entire Pokemon universe at your fingertips, you'd think that the developers would have wanted to implement it somewhere in the game. So while there are definitely some features brought in from Platinum to BDSP, leaving out the one thing that people expected to see means that Sinnoh does not pass this category. So that's third game integration out of the way. And I think from the perspective of a Pokemon fan, or at least someone who's nostalgic for the game being remade, I think the third game integration is the most important for them. What they look for in a remake is specifically that nostalgia trip that I've talked so much about. They might look at other additions or differences in the game and think that they're a little silly or odd to have in a remake, but demographically, these people might not be the intended audience for a Pokemon anymore, and they probably don't have the kind of time to dump into those silly additions that they're not fans of. So for them, they just want that warm, fuzzy feeling of nostalgia. The next topic we'll be looking at, which is post-game content, it's probably the most important feature for the intended audience of Pokemon games. Most of the people that fit into this demographic probably have not played the original game that's being remade, so nostalgia doesn't really matter to them. But what they do have is time. They have those 300 to 500 hours that we all did when we were little kids to pour into their Pokemon game of choice. So while this is more of a reason why it's important for all Pokemon games to have post-game content, I think there's also been a precedent set for remakes that they should have a lot of it. And that precedent started all the way back with Fire Red and Leaf Green. While, of course, Mewtwo is brought back from the originals, there wasn't really anything else to bring back. So, the developers decided to create the Sevi Islands, which is where most of the post-game of Fire Red and Leaf Green take place. There are 7 total islands to explore, most of which are accessible only after you beat the game, and none are available until you beat Blaine. In these areas, the player can run into Pokemon that are not available in the Kanto region, discover a few legendary Pokemon, and go through a subplot with a branch of Team Rocket. Overall, this content provides players with a lot to do and quite a few new maps to explore after beating the game. Up next is Heart Gold and Soul Silver, and these games were blessed with their originals already having the most expansive post-game in Pokemon up to that point, with the player being able to explore the entirety of the Kanto region upon beating the champion. So, of course that's back in the remakes, but on top of Kanto and its story, there's also a lot of other stuff to do as well. You can catch legendary Pokemon, explore Mount Silver, and participate in countless minigames like the Pokeathlon and the bug catching competition. I personally think that these minigames are why this will forever be some of my friends' favorite video games ever. Not to mention, this is the first remake to have gym leaders that the player can rematch. So even if you don't consider the Kanto region post-game for Heart Gold Soul Silver, I still think that there's plenty to do in these games after beating Red. The next remakes are Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and we've already gone over the biggest part of the postgame, which is the Delta episode. This checking off both third game integration and postgame content is part of the reason why I think the Delta episode is some of the best content that Game Freak has ever put out. But on top of that, Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire also has the Battle Resort, a small area with a few nods to other games and the Battle Maison. Though it is important to note that there are a number of people who were upset that the original Battle Frontier did not make an appearance in these games. However, there's also the ability to fly across Hoenn on Latias or Latios, and also a good number of legendary Pokemon that the player is able to catch. While flying is available before the player beats the game, most of its use is in the postgame, so I'm gonna count it here. With all of this content, I would say Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire more than makes up for other lost postgame content that the other third generation games had. So then that brings us to Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl. And while you can criticize the game for not having content in it from Platinum, I don't think you can criticize it in terms of postgame content. Diamond and Pearl already had a pretty healthy postgame, and BDSP only adds on to that. There's still the whole area to the northeast of the region, including the fight area, resort area, survival area, and Stark Mount. And although the Battle Frontier was taken away and replaced by the measly Battle Tower, I think Ramanas Park and the ability to capture pretty much every legendary up to the 4th generation makes up for that. So in my opinion, if you liked the postgame of Diamond and Pearl, you have no reason to dislike the postgame of BDSP. And going back to my introduction to this postgame section, I do think that all the remakes we've looked at have a good amount of post-game content, which continues to renew the precedent that a remake should have a lot to do after beating the champion. I think this point is a lot more important to future remake type games, including Legend ZA, but I'll save those talking points for a different video. So this brings us to our final category, so to speak, which is experimentation and gimmicks. This category is the hardest to describe, but easiest to point out examples for. I would attempt to describe these things as either generational or just total shots in the dark. So either this was a feature in a previous game in the same generation, or this feature could be something that a lot of fans have been clamoring for and the developers finally decided to give it to us. These types of things appeal most to the game design or Pokemon nerds, which it just so happens that I fall into both categories. The game design nerds can comment on how adding this feature adds to the core appeal of a Pokemon game, and the Pokemon nerds can freak out when the developers finally add a feature in gaming that's existed for a decade. Anyways, without any more cheap shots, let's get into this. Again, we'll first look at Fire Red and Leaf Green, and again, being the first remake, there's not a lot of experimentation or gimmicks added to these games. It's possible that I've missed something here, but I can't seem to think of any gimmick that has to do with this game. But I think that's because a lot of the things with these games that were probably seen as experimental upon release are just considered standard features and expectations of the remakes that we see today. And in that respect, I can only see Fire Red and Leaf Green as a massive success in terms of not only the features that they included in the first ever remake, but also for the fact that those features are now considered as integral to having a good remake now. For example, one of the biggest decisions that was made was inclusion of features and mechanics of the current generation. Not only do the Kanto remakes have the data of all Pokemon from the first 3 generations, they also included mechanical changes with those Pokemon, such as the IV changes and the special split into special attack and special defense. These decisions set a precedent for Pokemon remakes and bring those Pokemon remakes closer to remake territory instead of remaster territory. If we need evidence of the precedent that was set in Fire Red and Leaf Green, we just need to look at the next remakes, Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Just like the prior remakes, we have all of the 493 Pokemon's data in the game, and we have further means of capturing them through the use of the Pokegear. And once you have the next game with these features locked in, our expectations for them in the future remakes gets set in stone. But those features aren't the features that I want to look at in the second generation remakes, because after all, this category is experimentation and gimmicks, and continuation of features isn't really either of those. What I do want to talk about though might be one of the most beloved features in Pokemon ever following Pokemon, and I don't think I can oversell how critical of a feature this is in the Pokemon universe. As a game design nerd like I was describing earlier, following Pokemon is great for making the universe the players walk around in feel so much more real. Having one of your teammates, your friends, on the screen at all times following behind you makes the Pokemon world so much more engaging. And for just this game only, the Pokewalker, a small keepsake that could be carried around by anybody in real life, allows them to bring their Pokemon around with them, deepening their connection to that video game world. And even if the Pokewalker didn't pop off as much as the in-game feature, it still is a great concept from a game design perspective. In fact, if you asked some people, a must-have for them in terms of playing a Pokemon fan game would be this feature as well. I think that it's a massive testament to how beloved this feature from a single Pokemon game has become across the entire community. And one last thing before I stop glazing these games in terms of gimmicks and experiments is the subtle inclusion of being able to take pictures with your team in different places throughout the game. These pictures are a great way to take a snapshot of the player on their journey. The player can look back on these pictures after beating the champion, seeing their different Pokemon at different stages, different HM slaves at different times, and even different outfits. Things like this will keep these games in the player's mind for a long time after they beat it, as they can always look back and relive those small moments in their journeys. Going into the universe of Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire and the 6th generation, this is the first generation that had a battle mechanic gimmick that was central to the story of those games. So of course, since Oras was part of that generation, Mega Evolution was part of those games too, and probably the biggest gimmick that those games have. And while I know that there are certain people and certain communities who are rather negative on Mega Evolution as a concept, I overall think that it is a net positive to most Pokemon fans. Therefore, I would say that the gimmick of Mega Evolution was good for these games as well. And honestly, I don't think that's just because the idea of Mega Evolution is cool. I think the developers worked the concept into the game's story well instead of just shoehorning it in. Not to mention the Delta episode yet again, but Mega Rayquaza is pretty dope. On top of that, something that's a little sneaky that I would consider an experiment or a gimmick was the fact that this game kinda leans into all of the wild timeline theories that fans have about the Pokemon universe. Those types of videos and theories were really popular during the release of these games, I feel, and Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire just kinda throws those theories all over the place. The fact that Mauville City is now a mall, and the Battle Resort advertises the Battle Frontier, I feel like just threw everyone for a loop. While this doesn't really affect the core gameplay, it definitely brought more attention to the game and succeeded in its objective. So finally, this brings us to Brilliant Diamond, Shining Pearl, looking at gimmicks. And I think in these games, the experimentation in remakes comes to a halt. Sure, there is the new and improved underground system. It's a really cool feature that gets changed up a bit from the original games, but I don't think it's integral enough to a player's experience in BDSP to warrant being called a gimmick or experiment. And given that the target of this game was to faithfully recreate the original games, and given that this generation's battle gimmick left a lot to be desired, Dynamax isn't present in the game either. And just mentioning the fact that the target of BDSP wasn't to reinvent the wheel, it makes sense that this game doesn't really have any experimentation going on. So I can't give them a pass in this category. But as an aside that isn't relevant to the point I'm making, but something I do want to say in my desperate defense of BDSP is that a lot of the experimentation and changes that would have happened in BDSP were in Legends Arceus. And I think because I look at BDSP as a nostalgia trip and not the fully fledged Pokemon remake experience that we've gotten in the past. I'm more lenient when I don't see certain features that I wish I'd be able to see. It's probably because I see BDSP and Legends Arceus more as a package that recreates the 4th gen experience and not as two separate games that went at recreating the 4th generation in two different ways. So here we have our final report card, and the final grades are 2 out of 2 for Fire Red Leaf Green, 3 out of 3 for Heart Gold Soul Silver, 3 out of 3 for Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, and 1 out of 3 for Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl. And again, these grades are subjective and only marked on more of a pass-fail system rather than a classic A to F grading system. I decided for that just because I think it removes a lot of the bias that I would otherwise have in grading certain aspects for these remakes. But I think this grading system encapsulates the general feelings that Pokemon fans have for these remakes. The first 3 were slam dunks, and while I think different people have different opinions on the order of where they would put these remakes, I think that everybody would agree that those 3 games were successes. And then there's Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl. A good nostalgia trip, but not a good remake, because the nostalgia portion of the remake was BDSP, but the actual remake experience was delivered in Legends Arceus. And as I end this video, that's what I want you to think about. Pokemon and Game Freak, after seeing the success of Legends Arceus and the underwhelming performance of BDSP, decided that for the next remake cycle, they were just going to abandon the nostalgia trip in favor of only a Legends game. Thus, we have the release of Legends ZA releasing at the beginning of 2025 without the accompaniment of another game alongside it. So it puts the developers in an interesting situation, but I'll talk about that situation in a future video essay. For now, let's drive this thesis home. With more and more evidence, we've seen that Pokemon remakes are deemed successful based more on what has changed rather than what has stayed the same. But we also saw in the case of the Let's Go games that there needs to be at least a certain level of nostalgia upheld, specifically in the core playthrough experience, to get to that level of being judged on what has changed. We also dove deeper into a few different categories, looking at how changes or additions in these aspects are important areas to look for when talking about the success of remakes. Finally, I want to thank all of you for watching this video essay. I'm still very new to this world, and any feedback that you all have would be greatly appreciated. And if you're looking for more video essays or fan game content, please make sure to subscribe here so you don't miss any of that. And as I leave you, I encourage you to think about how what we talked about today impacts the upcoming release of Legends ZA.